Well, let's follow up with three members of Parliament now. I'm joined by Arif Virani, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice. Michael Cooper is the Deputy Justice Critic for the official opposition Conservatives. And Randall Garrison is the Justice Critic for the NDPs. Good to see you all. Thanks for being here. I want to get to the latest developments on the assisted dying legislation that's coming back before the House from the Senate. But first, let's deal with the justice reforms proposed by the government today, and we've heard from the Minister. So, Mr. Cooper, let me begin with you. Various federal ministers today launching this sweeping condemnation of mandatory minimums introduced by the previous Conservative government, including the constitutional challenges clogging up the courts and disproportionate harm caused to Indigenous and Black offenders. What's your response to that criticism?
My response to the government's bill is that it puts criminals first. This bill removes a number of mandatory minimums for some very serious offenses, including serious firearms offenses, including weapons trafficking, coming into possession of a firearm through the commission of an offense, using a firearm in the commission of an offense.
Well, the point they're making is that, look, we'll remove the we'll leave those decisions about what kind of penalty to impose to the judges, as opposed to the mandatory minimums legislated. So, do you believe that those mandatory minimums, as the government is insisting, do you believe that Indigenous and Black Canadians have been disproportionately harmed by those mandatory minimum measures?
Well, I believe that those mandatory jail times for those serious offenses need to remain in place. And when we're talking about changes with respect to drug-related offenses, I would agree that we need to ensure that Canada's drug laws are targeted towards those who take advantage of the vulnerable, those who suffer from addictions, those offenders who are involved in things like trafficking. And,
right, but do you accept that argument? Drugs? Do you accept the argument from the government? Do you accept the argument from the government that these have disproportionately harmed Indigenous Canadians and Black Canadians?
As I say, I take issue with removal of certain mandatory jail times for some serious offenses. That's the issue that I have with
All right. Mr. Garrison, what's the NDP's reaction to the measures being proposed by the federal government today?
Well, we've been long calling for taking action on drug possession of minor amounts for personal use, because we believe that addiction is a health problem and not a criminal justice problem. So while there's some good things in this bill, I remain disappointed that the government hasn't taken the step we've been calling for, and that is to completely decriminalize the personal possession of small amounts of drugs for your personal use. As well, there's no mention of expungement here. And one of the things that has contributed to the excessive harm to Black and Indigenous communities in particular is the fact that criminal records result from these minor drug possession charges that often restrict things like employment ability. So yes, some good steps in the right direction here, but as usual from this Liberal government, more rhetoric than actual progress.
Let me pick up on that. To Mr. Garrison's point, Mr. Virani, some people will look at these proposals and say they look like a half measure. If drug use is an addiction and health issue, not a public safety issue, why isn't your government moving to decriminalize drug possession for personal use altogether?
Well, let me take it seriatim, Peter. I think it's illuminating that you have Mr. Cooper unable to actually articulate in Black History Month the desperately disproportionate impact of mandatory minimums on Black Canadians in particular, let alone Indigenous people. In terms of statistics, they are startling. The number of Indigenous offenders admitted with an offence punishable by an MMP doubled between 2007 and 2016, doubled. And that's already reflected in the fact that 30% of federal inmates are Indigenous, whereas they represent 5% of the population. So that's the fact on the overrepresentation and the systemic racism that the system bequeathed to us by Stephen Harper has created. With respect to the point you just asked me in response to Mr. Garrison, I think it's an interesting commentary. We're looking forward to this being debated in the House and in the committee. What we would say with respect to drug and simple drug possession is that, yes, court time shouldn't be used and clogging up precious judicial resources with simple possession. That's why we're advocating for a diversion program that would be implemented that will help alleviate the records being created in the first instance, which Mr. Garrison is concerned about, as am I.
The examples given today, Mr. Cooper, about some of these cases involve in some cases, the government's pointing to cases involving single mothers coming to court because of simple drug possession issues and so on. Are you suggesting that there's no room for easing any of these mandatory minimums in any of these cases, even some of, personal possession of drug use?
That's not what I'm saying
Okay, what are
at
you
all. I believe that when it comes to certain simple possession offenses, that could be looked at in terms of removing certain mandatory jail times. But we have to ensure that our laws are targeted against those who prey on the vulnerable, who prey on people who suffer from addictions. And quite frankly, in this bill, there's very little comfort for those Canadians because, again, it removes mandatory jail time for people who are involved in trafficking of drugs, in growing harmful drugs. So that is
and
the
puts
issue.
that power, I guess, puts that power back. Puts that power back with.
And it's important that we acknowledge the impact that the criminal laws have had to certain communities, including Black Canadians, Indigenous Canadians. I'm not denying that at all. I think that is a serious issue, but we have to look at what is in the bill, and what is in the bill is the removal of mandatory jail time for not only things like simple possession, but for some very serious offenses. And that's a whole other issue.
Mr. Garrison, I want to move us along, if I can, now to the assisted dying file. The Senate sent back to the House now the government's assisted dying legislation, which has already been passed by the House. And Senate's inserted 5 amendments that go much further than the House bill, including allowing people who worry they will lose their mental capacity to make advance requests for assisted death, and another imposing an 18-month sunset clause on the bill's ban on assisted death for people whose underlying chronic condition is a mental illness. How open is your party to those changes?
Well, first of all, we're not very open to amendments coming from an unelected and unaccountable body like the Senate, no matter what topic we're on. And so when I look at what the Senate did, their traditional role was to review what the House did, to look for errors and omissions, and to provide some stronger regional representation. That's not what this is about at all. They've completely redone the work that had already been done in the House of Commons. And so we think that the Bill C-7 should proceed as it was originally approved in the House, but we don't get to decide that. The government will present us with some kind of motion, either accepting or rejecting amendments, and until we see what the Liberals are going to put in front of us, we can't say exactly what we'll do.
All right, Mr. Virani, the Senate makes the case that it's standing up for fundamental constitutional rights, and its role is to protect those where they think MPs may have failed to do so. Is your government willing to accept the Senate amendments, all of them, or even some of them, or flat out no?
So the short answer is that's under active consideration. If I could just make a very brief response to Mr. Cooper with respect to the mandatory minimums. The issue of trafficking is not on the table in terms of removing mandatory minimums. We are going after drug traffickers and firearms traffickers. We are not seeking to criminalize people who are involved in simple possession or a simple firearms offense.
Okay, so I need a quick answer. I need a quick answer from you then on whether you're going to accept the Senate amendments.
Yes, with respect to MAID, Peter, and I don't mean to not address your question. With respect to MAID, we're looking carefully at all of those matters. Some of them are meant to be the subject of the review that is the 5-year mandatory review. They require very careful consideration, particularly the mental illness point. But we're looking forward to debate and, most importantly, looking forward to meeting the court-imposed deadline.
Mr. Cooper, there's a court-imposed deadline here of next Friday to get this bill passed in some form. What do you think needs to happen next year? Are Conservatives prepared to entertain some of the Senate amendments, or what's your position?
I would hope that the government reject the Senate amendments. Quite frankly, the current bill, before it went to the Senate, went well beyond the scope of the Cruchon decision in terms of removing critical safeguards. And I think that we saw, as a result, very significant opposition from, for example, the disabilities rights community, who are very concerned that vulnerable persons could be put at risk. I believe that before expanding the regime any further, what is required is a parliamentary review, a review that was supposed to happen last spring, that never happened, and instead what we have is a very flawed piece of legislation that, based upon the testimony before the Justice Committee, and the testimony
Okay,
of
gotta-
witnesses before the
gotta
Legal
stop
and
you there.
Constitutional Affairs Committee leaves almost
Got to stop
no
you
one
there,
happy
Mr.
with
Cooper.
the
So we think there might be some debate on this coming up in the days ahead in the House, and we'll look forward to hearing from you, all of you, when that happens. But thanks for your time tonight, gentlemen. Good to speak with you all.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Peter.
Thank you.